All right, so now let's turn to St. Augustine. I got report that the lecture on Aristotle Book 2 didn't record. Thought it recorded. Apparently it didn't. I'll do something about that. So let's just turn to St. Augustine before I address that problem. So Augustine lived from November 13th, 354 AD, by the way, which means Anno Domini. That means the year of the Lord, to August 28th, 430. By the way, some of your professors will say CE, the Common Era, but that's kind of pointless because it's the same year, right? They'd say 354, the Common Era, and you have to ask, well, why is that? Why is the year 354? Because it's dated from the birth of Jesus Christ. You can't get around the fact that it's the reference point is Jesus Christ. You just got to deal with it. Now we can replace the dates entirely, right, with dates from the Jewish calendar or the Hindu calendar or something of that sort, but then most of you would have no idea what's going on. So rather than conceal, put a veil over plain fact, I just say Anno Domini. So he was born November 13th, 354 to August 28th, 430, Anno Domini. And he was born and raised in Tagaste, in the North African district of the Roman Empire, present-day Algiers. So note that this was an intensely Christian area at the time, with its own peculiar Christian culture, but that this would later be wiped away by the Muslim invasion of the 7th century, which you have to think of the Mediterranean at that time and prior to that as composing a world of trade between the Southern Europeans and the North Africans and the residents of what we today could call the Near East. There were intensive cultural interactions in that entire area, and that was brought to an abrupt end when Islam took over North Africa and part of Spain, and at that point Christianity had become dominant in Southern Europe and in Turkey, well, what we today call Turkey. It wasn't called Turkey back then. And then we have two worlds opposing one another that are antagonistic to one another and at war, right? Okay, so it's good to keep those historical movements in mind. So Augustine was educated in nearby Carthage in the art of rhetoric. I guess it was rebuilt because the original Carthage was wrecked, with a view towards an imperial career. His mind and intellectual progress is defined by numerous encounters with different religious and metaphysical systems that, in fact, mutually contradict one another, which comes as no surprise, but which together formed the pressures which prompted Augustine to formulate the most influential set of theological writings, we can add philosophical, of Christianity's first millennium. St. Paul, of course, accepted, at least with respect to the theological part of his writings. The purely philosophical, Augustine takes the lead in that particular category. St. Paul didn't really write any philosophy, not any that we perceived. So the first influence to be mentioned was that of his own mother, Saint Monica. She was actually sainted. She's a saint. And she died in 388, by the way, on a trip from Italy back to North Africa with her son, and her grandson was with them at that time. And St. Monica raised St. Augustine to believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ. So this is an early formative influence on him. But she did not have her boy baptized. This delay was presumably to gain the advantage of being able to wipe away all of his sins at a later time. Right? That sounds almost like cheating. And Augustine himself notes in his Confessions that this is an illegitimate motivation for a Christian parent to adopt. So he says, get the kid baptized as soon as possible. They had the sacrament of confession and reconciliation, which also wipes away whatever sins are confessed, and those additional sins which one cannot legitimately remember, right? So why wait? At the age, and I think that was established at that time, I'd have to be talking to a consultant, a history on the matter. So at the age of 18 or 19, he joined Augustine joined the Manichaean cult. This is an interesting group. The Manichaeans taught a basic dualism of good and evil, with the good eventually triumphing. So I should emphasize that for the Manichaeans, it's not the case that everything flows from, as it were, supernatural goodness that causes all things good and nothing evil. It's that there is goodness and there is evil, and they're basic, and they are antagonistic and at war. But evil is part of the structure of the universe and forms a legitimate part of it. It has its own rights against the good. Okay? They had something resembling a yin-yang view of the universe. Okay. But since in some peculiar way, goodness is always prior to evil, good will eventually triumph. So the Manichaeans are thought to have been Gnostics, or there was a form of Gnosticism. Now, what's that? That's a religion that teaches salvation through knowledge. Okay? Salvation through knowledge, not through grace, right? As the Christians teach and taught, but through some kind of intellectual attainment, something that you can gain on your own, right? You can rise by your own power. That's the key to Gnosticism. And it's rather similar to the sort of, I call it a singularity in the history of religion that one encounters with the birth of philosophy itself in ancient Greece. Now, the philosophers didn't believe in a basic dualism of good and evil. In fact, they come to deny it. But be careful there. We talked about it last time a little bit. Okay, so you could perhaps see that. You can find it in Plato and Aristotle in different versions. They have different versions of it. But they do, if they don't use the word salvation, the early philosophers talk about a kind of beatitude, a kind of blessedness you attain through knowledge, which you do rise to through your own efforts. So there's some kind of similarity, at least on that point. And this Gnosticism, it's usually observed, is based in the Zoroastrianism of ancient Iran. And Zoroaster is thought to have been the very first religious figure whose name has recorded, whose name has been recorded and handed down to us. There were other figures, clearly, for example, the authors of the Vedas, but in India, we don't have their names, right? We know who Zoroaster is, and we received his Zend Avesta, his holy text, according to him. People who practice, there still are Zoroastrians, by the way. I think there's 30 or 40,000 of them, maybe a few more. Yeah, it exists. And anyway, Manichaeism is a kind of Gnosticism, which some way depends on Zoroastrianism, though it's difficult to tighten up those linkages historically with documentary evidence, archaeological digs and things of that sort. So as he was moving away from Manichaeanism due to an unimpressive performance by one of its chief exponents, a certain Faustus, by the way, he nearly simultaneously came under the tutelage of St. Ambrose of Milan, and there are his dates, AD, obviously, and some Christian Neoplatonists who introduced him in particular to the figure of Plotinus, who thought of himself as an enemy of Christianity. So in the language we have adopted in this course, the Neoplatonists, what happened here? We have this red, we don't need that. There we go. The Neoplatonists were, after a fashion, atheistic supernaturalists, if you remember back to the first lecture. And that they believed, these Neoplatonists believed in a supernatural reality, the first principle of which was the one above all thinking, willing, sensing, and cosmic realities. So there's this transcendent one above our cosmic realities, okay? But there's a little twist. You know, I give you these schemes. That's where you start, and then you dive into and dig into philosophy, and you have to understand the qualifications and complexities. Because these people could also be called qualified theistic supernaturalists, but in a qualified way. And that they taught that a transcendent intellect, right? A transcendent intellect was the product of an emanation from the one. But that this intellect also transcends our cosmos. You see that? So you'd have the one up here without an act of will, through a pure radiation of energy, as it were. It would generate the intellect, okay? The intellect would generate the world soul, and the world soul would generate our cosmos. All right? That's the basic idea. All right. So Augustine would draw ideas from the Neoplatonists for the rest of his career. So you note he had a respect for them and learned from them. His major correction was to identify the one with the intellect. So for Augustine, the one doesn't emanate the intellect. The one and the intellect are the same. And the one, which is eternal and unlimited or infinite intellect, is eternal and infinite will. Okay? So that's a person. And that's the position of, that's the unqualified position of theistic supernaturalism, which I call it, as I call it. So he identified the result of these identifications with the Christian God, for whose reality he argued forcefully in Book 11 of his Confessions, okay, which we haven't studied together. I take my Intro to Philosophy course, and we'll do that. So he forcefully opposed two Christian sects, each of which was designated a heresy. Right, so the reason I'm going through all this stuff is to show you all these pressures that were placed on him. First his mother's Christianity, right? Then the Manichaean Gnosticism, which he violently rejects at one point, and just argues against it with all he's got. And then Neoplatonism, which he accepts to a point, right? But then he modifies it. So there's an infusion of Neoplatonism as he's becoming a Christian, and he, to this day, is described as a Christian Neoplatonist. Okay, and that's a very important thing to know, because he's the most important Christian thinker of the first 1,000 years of Christianity. So Neoplatonism becomes extremely important, ultimately for understanding the history of Christianity, right? So there are two sects he opposes. First, the sect following Pelagius taught that a human being had the power on his own not to sin, right? Now, this very nearly implies that a human being can merit election to live in heaven by his own merits, okay? And that's something which Augustine, again and again and again and again, he's going to reject. And we'll even see a kind of version of this, or something parallel to this, in his critique of the Stoics. Augustine, by contrast, argues that human beings are radically dependent upon something above themselves, grace. Just as a plant requires sunlight, and if you take the plant and you put it inside of a cave, it's going to die. A human being requires supernatural light. And if you take the human being and put him in something in the analog of a cave, he can do that simply by turning his back on the light. He'll die too. You follow? So Pelagianism was condemned in 418. I mean, these doctrines are not that difficult to understand. You just have to study them. So the second sect he opposed was that of the Donatists. They taught only that those who are morally pure have the capacity to administer the Christian sacraments. So what's a sacrament? Later, sacrament is defined as a visible sign of divine grace. Most well known, I guess, would be the Eucharist. The body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ appearing as bread and wine, right, concealing the actual substantial presence, the real presence of God. And then there's confession and reconciliation, right? Holy matrimony is named later, I think in the 13th century, if I'm not mistaken. Holy orders and the like. Okay. So, like the Pelagians, they seem to have, the Donatists, right? They seem to have held that human beings can either be perfect or at least near perfect, right? Otherwise, there's no point talking about purity as a condition for being a priest, at least an efficacious priest. By opposing their doctrine, Augustine established once and for all that the sacraments administered by a validly ordained priest who is morally corrupt are just as efficacious as those administered by one who is morally pure. Divine omnipotence cannot be limited by corrupted instruments. That's where he ends up, and that conclusion is, as they say in the church, is dead fide. You're required to believe it. Okay. Sometimes in the modern world, we're kind of uncomfortable with the ideas of authority dictating to us what we ought to believe and not to believe, because we think that, we're free to form your own opinion, so on and so forth. Yet it's surprising how many people you meet who vigorously defend this idea that there has to be an authority, an authoritative institution, which has the authority to teach us what the truth is. And even if we don't understand it yet, and even if we don't accept the arguments for it, we're still under its authority. That cuts against the grain of the modern sensibility, right? And I've met no small number of people who defend this too. If they're correct, then what they're saying is that there is an institution which is based in a supernatural reality, which then exercises an authority over human beings and calls them into itself so that it can mold them within itself, so that it can raise them up from their present darkness, because right now we can't see and can't reason clearly because our minds are corrupted. It can gradually raise them up to the point where they can make certain intellectual connections and have insights which they wouldn't have had before, and gradually grow in wisdom, but always through that assistance which one doesn't get unless one submits oneself to that authority. I guess it's similar basically in anything. You want to study accounting, you have to submit yourself to the authority of your accounting professor who will teach you the ropes. You want to learn statistics. Well, statistics is a very counterintuitive body of knowledge. The basic principles of statistics, no one would expect those to obtain unless you were actually educated in the subject. Here you were a genius and invented it. Okay, you follow me? So sooner or later, even in natural knowledge, we have to submit ourselves to authority. So it's not that crazy an idea. It's just in this case, the authority is supposed to be transcendent. Okay. So metaphysically, he argues that naturalism is incoherent, right? The idea that there's nothing but our universe. He arrives at this conclusion from a consideration of the nature of time. Each moment is limited and disappears into the past. As such, it lacks the power to generate the next moment, which of course cannot cause itself to be. The very nature of time is such as to point above itself to a creator in virtue of which it can exist at all. Okay, that's an interesting idea. That how can time subsist in and of itself insofar as it's continuously vanishing? And how can the present moment produce the next moment if the present moment is in the process of disappearing and being replaced by the next moment? And how can it be replaced by the next moment if the next moment in and of itself doesn't even exist as the present moment is disappearing? So the present moment is disappearing, the next moment, which hasn't yet come into existence, replaces it, and one is hard pressed to put one's finger on anything in the universe which is actually sufficient to keep this whole temporal process going. And so he says, no, it's not the case that anything in the universe on its own is keeping this whole temporal process going. There's something outside of this temporal process that generates it, and that is what keeps it going, right? That's the creator. So whatever the merits of this argument, he offers a parallel set of arguments for a transcendent God in his critique of Stoicism. Right? You see how his thinking, it always it holds together at various levels. We've already seen a couple. Well, he can in fact agree with the Stoics that one ought to identify one's will with that of God, and thus wholly deny oneself as an independent will. Right? Remember the Stoics said you ought to identify your will with that of God? Well, Augustine should be happy with that, right? And if you do that, you deny yourself as an independent will with your own ideas, willing things apart from God. You say that's a bad idea. So he could agree with him on this, but he doesn't mention this important agreement even once in the text that we have read. But I want to emphasize that because actually there is an important sort of element in Stoicism which Augustine actually could have identified and incorporated into his system. He kind of missed an opportunity. So instead, he may have been thinking of a Stoic other than Epictetus, or who knows who he read. We don't know. Instead, he isolates a peculiar incoherence in Stoic ethics that proves that Stoic naturalist physics must be incorrect. Okay? The basic premise of which is that there's nothing beyond our cosmos. Now, as far as if they talk about certain principles in the structuring of the cosmos, he can perhaps work with those, but he can't accept that there is nothing but our cosmos, pervaded throughout by the God. That's the Stoic doctrine. So he rejects that. But we'll see why. We've already seen why in connection with time. We'll see why in connection with ethics. Okay. So let's turn to the City of God, chapter 19. What the Christians believe regarding supreme good and evil in opposition to the philosophers, who have maintained that the supreme good is in themselves. So by the philosophers, he means the Stoics. Now, there were more than Stoic philosophers at his time. Okay, there were still Aristotelians running around. We know with certainty there were Neoplatonists, but he doesn't call them the philosophers for whatever reason. All right, there were Epicureans, still moving to and fro. Okay, or doing their thing in their garden apart from the city. But the philosophers remember the Stoics. So the Stoics, we have seen, taught that virtue is perfect self-control. That this perfect self-control is in one's grasp. You can attain this. And that if you were to attain it, this will make you happy. Okay? And that happiness, of course, takes the form of pure tranquility. That's something else that's in your control, because it's the consequence of something, the effect of something that is in your control. You can't generate it immediately, but you can generate it as an effect of something else that you can generate. But they also taught, Stoics also taught, that it is rational to commit suicide. Okay, we didn't talk about that in our discussion of the Stoics. We're bringing it in now. Augustine will argue that this is ultimately a contradiction. Why would you say that it's possible to be happy here, but that it's rational to commit suicide? If you're happy, why commit suicide? Doesn't make any sense, right? So let's dig into this a bit. The resolution to the contradiction is to deny theistic naturalism in favor of theistic supernaturalism. Okay, that's the key. That's the key right there. All right. Basically, that he's going to argue that theistic naturalism leads to this contradiction, and anything that leads to a contradiction should be rejected. So you reject theistic naturalism, you replace it with theistic supernaturalism, and the contradiction vanishes. All right. All right, let's look at his argumentation now. So his principal argumentative strategy is to argue that virtue itself is engaged in an endless struggle with vice, but with no hope of final victory. That's his general characterization of virtue as such. It's a kind of bitter struggle against vice without the possibility of attaining what the Stoics are actually talking about, that is perfect self-control. All right. So look at this. I mean, the Stoics say you can attain perfect self-control, but then they say it's rational to commit suicide. So maybe they're giving something away there, right? And saying that, well, as a matter of fact, you can't gain perfect self-control, so better just to opt out, as it were. Okay. So that is, it is impossible that even perfect virtue make one happy, right? It is impossible that even perfect virtue make one happy. So Augustine is sort of turning the screws here. Let's say you did attain perfect virtue. Even that would not make you happy, right? Because that virtue itself is nothing but a struggle. And you can go on trying to trick yourself into thinking that things that are painful and onerous and unpleasant are not. But of course they are, right? Okay. Putting to one side this idea that maybe one can, like a swami, what's the other word again? A fakir, like an Indian fakir, just turn pain off. Okay, and it's possible the Stoics were doing that. If they were capable of doing that, they might have a comeback against Augustine here. But it seems that they weren't capable of doing that, right? Because they counseled suicide. So, oh well, no Stoic fakirs as far as we know. But the world's a very complicated place. Maybe there were a couple, who knows. So Augustine will establish this denial of a basic Stoic premise that virtue will make you happy, right? And then he'll show that the Stoics, in fact, agree with him despite themselves. And we've already seen why, or how he's going to go about showing that they really do ultimately agree. So let's begin by taking prudence. Prudence discerns goods amidst evils. That's what it does. It discerns goods amidst evils and orders those goods towards some ultimate good, which is the aim of the action one has willed to be. But this confirms that we are surrounded by evils, doesn't it? Now, the Stoic might reply, of course, that these supposed evils, they're nothing to him. Or that, in fact, he positively wills what other people call evil, he wills them as good, insofar as they are providentially ordained, merging his will with that of God. Nonetheless, Augustine thinks he has scored a point here and moves on. So I'm not going to make this easy on Augustine. It seems that the Stoics have a reply there. So Augustine takes justice to prove that we are laboring towards our end, as justice is by definition the good of another, right? And we talked a little bit about that in the case of the Stoics, that God seems to have appointed us to the post of benefiting one another, cooperating and helping one another, right? And that even if we don't have the power to guarantee that our effort at help is going to produce the desired effect, no matter, it's our job, just do it. Okay, that is in your power. That's interesting. It is in your power to do your work. Just do that. As far as whether that work is going to be efficacious or not, there's no guarantee there, so don't worry about that. You see the difference? Okay. And it's not enough just to have good intentions. Have a good intention, act on the good intention. The effect is the effect. Maybe you'll work 10 years on something and it'll all explode at the end. Well, no matter. You can tell the God that you did your duty, and that's the end of it. Again, the Stoic could reply that by doing his duty as prescribed by God, he upholds the divine will, right? And that in contenting himself with what is providentially ordained, including paying others what is due to them, he can remain content with himself. Okay, so, I like to pursue this and in a dialectical way, not just have Augustine knock down the Stoics, but see how they might defend themselves. But Augustine, of course, is not done. He moves to the virtue of fortitude. He takes this to be the plainest proof of the ills of this life, and it is the virtue of enduring them. Now, the Stoic may again reply in his usual mode about being either indifferent to what others call evil, or in fact embracing divine providence. But why? Here's the difficulty for the Stoic, because they seem to have been putting up a pretty good fight up to this point. Maybe you agree with me on that. Of course, I'm putting up the fight for them, but I got the ideas from them. It's their ideas. Why then does the Stoic permit and even praise suicide as a means for escaping the evils of this life? How can the man who solemnly declares, "Man your post," countenance abandoning one's post through an act of self-killing? Man your post, abandon your post. There seems to be a basic contradiction there, right? But the praise of suicide nonetheless appears paradigmatically Stoic. This is a commonplace, by the way, that suicide is, as it were, the perfection of a Stoic act of will. Not active, act of will, okay? For what sterner demonstration of total self-mastery could there be than the deliberate, disciplined, and violent taking of one's own life, right? That seems to be self-mastery. It's like ritual seppuku in Japan. It's a very powerful, it's a very painful way of dying, by the way. For the Stoic, suicide is the perfect demonstration of perfect self-control. So a Stoic might even reply at this point and say, well, suicide is not being pursued to escape this world, but to, as it were, provide the demonstration of the possession of perfect self-control. And the Stoic himself can't even know that he possesses it unless he himself demonstrates its possession. You follow? You can't know you have it unless you exercise the capacity. And so suicide becomes a rational action to take if you're a Stoic. Well, might strike us as crazy, right? But you can see there's a certain logic to it. However, for Augustine, the Stoics combine three defects. First, from Augustine's point of view, they succumb to stupid pride, and that's his words, in thinking that they can achieve the good in this life by their own power. Second, they succumb to a kind of self-deception in praising what one may reasonably take to be a sufficient sign that in fact happiness in this life is unavailable, right? They praise suicide, but that would seem to be a sufficient indication that, happiness is really not available here. So let's say you want to demonstrate you have perfect self-control, but you're also happy. Well, why would you want to make that demonstration at the expense of your happiness? The fact that they're willing to do that would seem to indicate they're not really happy, or they're deceiving themselves in this respect, right? In any event, if this happiness were available, what reasonable person would dispense with it for the sake of simply proving to oneself one has perfect self-control? That seems a little bit like an abandonment of certain core common sense, right? So third, they exhibit hypocrisy in praising the Stoic life and praising the destruction of the Stoic life, or at least inconsistency, right? All right. That the evils of this life motivate the Stoics to praise and counsel suicide show how monumental these present evils in fact must be. That's one of Augustine's major points, right? Okay. Well, I mean, what's suicide? Suicide is a free act whereby one negates one's instinct to self-preservation and destroys the union of body and soul. Okay, for the Stoics, the soul would just be a kind of very fine, almost air-like substance. I think it's separation from the body and then gets blown to bits relatively soon thereafter for the Stoics, if I'm not mistaken. All right. So when counsels such a thing, that would seem to say, well, listen, this life is so bad that it just makes sense to put an end to it. In a way, Stoicism, maybe it's based on a death wish. I don't really want to live, so I'm going to try to ignore everything around me, pretend that all the evil things that are happening, uncomfortable, humiliating, unpleasant things, I'm going to pretend all this stuff really doesn't make any difference. I'm going to go on with the sensations, the negative sensations I experience in virtue of these things, but I'll try to minimize those. Someone insults me, I'll just dismiss it. That's probably good counsel. Just forget about it. First, physical pain, I'll not dwell on it. That seems good counsel too, but also try to cure yourself, surely. And that's it, right? Well, that seems to be a kind of accommodation to the fact that one, it's an accommodation to a world that one all along regards as somehow awful, right? Okay. All right, here we go. And yet we desire to be happy, and we do so by nature. Now, this is an important line of reflection here, okay? This is a new argument. Why are you taking this class? Well, two reasons. You want to get some intellectual training, okay? And number two, you want to get a degree, and then you can use that to gain a position somewhere and take care of yourself, people you love. All right. So why do you want those two things? Why do you want an education, and why do you want to be able to take care of yourself and people you love? Well, let's cut to the chase and just say that you want to be happy, okay? And you think you'll be happier, or maybe be happy, if you have a better education and you're able to take care of yourself and people you love. So happiness is the aim of human existence, and we aim at it by nature. It's all people want it, without exception. Doesn't matter where you encounter them in the world and at what time historically. So it's our natural end, okay? Everyone agrees. So the Stoics inadvertently show us that happiness is not available in this world. Nothing that points towards an end points towards something that is impossible. Okay. So let's be careful here. So the Stoics, despite themselves, show us that happiness is not available in the cosmos. In philosophy, we say immanently. There is no immanent happiness, at least according to them. But nothing that points towards an end, as we do, points towards something that is impossible. But if happiness is not possible, how can there be any human beings at all? Because our whole nature points at happiness. How can a nature point at something impossible? Let's argue by analogy here. The nature of the spider inclines it to spin webs and eat flies. And this it does accomplish, right? The nature of the dolphin inclines it to swim and eat fish. And this it too accomplishes, okay? The nature of man inclines him to seek happiness, and this he must be able to accomplish by analogy with the spider and the dolphin. This is not possible in this world, as the Stoics have shown us. Or since this is not possible in this world, it must be possible in a transcendent world, okay? Hence, the virtues of this world are good as helpful against the evils of this life. The Stoics are right about that. And if there is happiness here at all, it is rooted, not what the Stoics have said, perfect self-control, because that's just a confirmation of evils, and they admit that when they counsel suicide. Perfect happiness, not perfect, but a certain kind of happiness here is rooted in hope for a future life shared with God. For St. Paul, following Augustine here, teaches that we are saved by hope for that which we do not yet see. Okay? That is your life with God. But if we are saved by hope, people, if you talk to practicing Christians, they tell you that they get little anticipations and kind of flavors of the future life, moments of joy and whatnot. They say go completely beyond what can be provided by a Taylor Swift concert or anything of that sort. So that's just what they say. But if we are saved by hope, likewise are we made happy by hope. We're saved by it, we're made happy by it. Okay, see what let's try to interpret that. That is, the person whose mind looks away as an exile here on the earth, right? From the things of the world, looks away from the applause of the world, looks away from its pleasures, looks away from money and wealth, looks away from all worldly power, right? And looks instead to the happiness of the next world. That person gains a kind of happiness here, right? It's called joy, right? Which supervenes on the suffering of this world and can be had only in virtue of hope for the next. Make any sense? And then Augustine would add immediately, just listen to the text, this hope and this joy is rooted not in one's own attainment, not in what he would call stupid pride, but through divine grace, which the human being needs as its supernatural light, as the plant needs the natural light of the sun. Okay, so hopefully that's intelligible. It's not a very long lecture, but I think it's good enough for our purposes. And it's a short reading, and I really don't have much else to say. Okay, so we're going to leave it at that. Usually when I would teach this text in class, we'd get a whole period out of this, but basically I got across what needs to be got across. That's it. All right, folks, have a great weekend, and I'll put up the journal and everything.